I always thought I had the textbook definition of a good life. I was 28, living in a decent-sized suburb just outside of Chicago, and working a standard 9-to-5 corporate job that paid the bills but didn't exactly set my soul on fire. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for 3 years, together for 6. We have that kind of comfortable, predictable love that you see in sitcoms, the kind where you know exactly what the other person is going to order at dinner before the waiter even comes to the table. We bought a small 2-bedroom starter home with a decent backyard, a mortgage we could just barely afford, and a golden retriever named Max. It was the American dream, or at least the version of it we had been sold. We spent our weekends doing grocery runs at Trader Joe's, hosting occasional barbecues for our small circle of friends, and watching Netflix until we fell asleep on our gray sectional sofa. It was safe, it was quiet, it was completely ordinary. Then came Mark. Mark had been my best friend since our freshman year at Ohio State. He was the exact opposite of me in every way that mattered. Where I was cautious and structured, Mark was impulsive and magnetic. He was the guy who could walk into a crowded bar full of strangers and leave with 5 new phone numbers and an invitation to a house party. He had this effortless charisma that made people want to be around him, including me. But that kind of lifestyle has a shelf life. And by the time we hit our late 20s, Mark's spontaneous charm was starting to look a lot like instability. He spent years bouncing from city to city, trying to make it as a freelance graphic designer, always living just one bad month away from eviction. I hadn't seen him in person for almost 2 years when he called me out of the blue on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. He was at a truck stop somewhere in Indiana, sitting in his beat-up Honda Civic with everything he owned packed into the trunk. His latest relationship had imploded, his freelance contract had fallen through, and he was completely broke. He sounded smaller than I had ever heard him. The usual swagger in his voice was gone, replaced by a raw, exhausted desperation that caught me completely off guard. He didn't outright ask to stay with me, but he didn't have to. He was my brother. We had shared cheap beer, broken hearts, and college finals. You don't turn your back on someone who knows the worst parts of you and still sticks around. When I hung up the phone and told Sarah, she wasn't thrilled. I could see the immediate tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the hallway of our small house. We didn't exactly have a lot of extra space. Our second bedroom had been converted into a home office for her, which meant Mark would have to sleep on our living room couch. Sarah liked her privacy and her routine, and having a third person, especially a chaotic variable like Mark, disrupting our quiet domestic life was a lot to ask. But she knew how much Mark meant to me. She saw the worry on my face, and after a long silence, she sighed, reached over to squeeze my hand, and told me it was fine. She said it would only be for a couple of weeks until he got back on his feet. We both genuinely believed that. Mark arrived the next morning, looking like a ghost of himself. He had dark circles under his eyes, his clothes were wrinkled, and he seemed physically diminished. But within 48 hours of crashing on our sectional, the old Mark started to bleed back through. He was incredibly grateful, almost painfully so. He insisted on doing the dishes, walking Max, and helping Sarah carry in the groceries. He had this way of making himself useful without being intrusive, and to my immense relief, Sarah's initial coldness began to thaw. Within a week, the dynamic in the house shifted from an awkward houseguest situation to something that felt strangely alive. That was the first thing I noticed. The energy in the house changed. For years, Sarah and I had lived in a quiet, comfortable rhythm. We didn't talk much after work because we already knew everything about each other's days. But Mark brought a new current into our living room. He would sit at the kitchen island while Sarah cooked, telling hilarious, self-deprecating stories about his failed freelance gigs or his disastrous dating life in Austin. I would come home from my soul-crushing corporate job to find the two of them laughing hysterically over some inside joke they'd developed during the day. At first, it made me happy. I was glad my best friend was getting along with my wife. I loved seeing Sarah laugh like that. Deep, uninhibited laughter that I realized, with a small pang of guilt, I hadn't heard from her in a very long time. But weeks turned into 2 months, and the temporary arrangement became our new normal. Mark found a part-time job bartending at an upscale lounge downtown, which meant he was working late nights and sleeping in during the day. My schedule was the exact opposite. I was up at 6 in the morning, fighting traffic on the I-90, and not getting home until 6 or 7 in the evening. Because of his late shifts, Mark was often home during the afternoons when Sarah was finishing up her remote work. They started spending a lot of time together in those empty midday hours. It started small, running errands together, grabbing coffee down the street, taking Max to the dog park. Sarah would mention it casually over dinner. Mark helped me pick up the new rug for the office, or Mark thinks we should try that new taco place on Fort Street. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? This was my best friend, the guy who stood next to me at my wedding. And this was my wife, the woman I had built a life with. The thought of anything inappropriate happening between them didn't just seem impossible. It didn't even register as a concept in my brain. I trusted them both implicitly. In fact, I felt a sense of pride that I was able to provide a safe harbor for my friend while keeping my marriage solid. But looking back, the signs were there, written in the subtle shifts of human behavior that you only notice when it's far too late. It was the way the room would suddenly get a little quieter when I walked in, not because they were hiding something, but because the natural flow of their conversation had broken. It was the way Sarah started dressing up a little more, even on days when she didn't leave the house. She replaced her oversized college sweatshirts with nice sweaters, and she started wearing a touch of perfume that she usually saved for date nights. It was the way Mark began to look at her when he thought I wasn't paying attention, not with the casual look of a friend, but with an intense, quiet appreciation. I ignored all of it, because my own life was starting to demand more of my attention. The company I worked for was going through a major restructuring, and my boss had hinted that a significant promotion was on the table if I could pull off a massive logistics project. It meant longer hours, more stress, and complete exhaustion. I was checked out when I was home, my mind constantly hovering over spreadsheets and corporate timelines. I was physically present, but emotionally absent, sitting on the edge of the couch with my laptop open while Sarah and Mark watched a movie a few feet away. I felt a sense of security knowing Mark was there to keep her company while I poured everything into this career milestone. I thought I was doing it for us, for our future, to finally pay off that mortgage and maybe start a family. The turning point happened on a Thursday in mid-December. The weather had turned brutal, a classic Chicago freeze that turned the streets into sheets of gray ice. I had been at the office since 7 in the morning, prepping for a final presentation that was supposed to happen the following Monday. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, my brain was entirely fried. My boss walked into my cubicle, looked at the dark circles under my eyes, and told me to go home. He said the servers were going down for maintenance anyway, and there was nothing more I could do until morning. I remember the feeling of relief that washed over me as I walked out to my car. The corporate parking lot was nearly empty, the wind howling across the blacktop. I couldn't wait to get home, strip off my suit, and just lay in bed next to Sarah. I wanted to tell her that the worst of the project was over, that I was finally going to have my weekends back, and that we could plan a trip somewhere warm for January. I wanted to reclaim my life. The drive home took 45 minutes through the blinding sleet. When I finally pulled into our driveway, I noticed the house was dark, except for a single warm light casting a glow from the upstairs bedroom window. Mark's Civic wasn't in the driveway, which meant he was likely working his usual Thursday night shift at the lounge. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing it would just be Sarah and me tonight. I unlocked the front door quietly, trying not to wake Max, but the dog didn't come running to the door like he usually did. The lower level of the house was freezing, the thermostat turned down low. I dropped my briefcase by the entryway, kicked off my frozen dress shoes, and walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost unnatural. It was that thick, suffocating quiet that precedes a storm. I walked up the creaking wooden stairs, my socks muffling the sound of my footsteps. As I reached the top landing, I could see the door to our master bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out onto the hardwood floor. I smiled, thinking Sarah was probably reading in bed or watching something on her laptop. I reached out, pushed the door open, ready to say her name, ready to tell her I was home early. The words died in my throat. The world didn't stop turning, but it felt like the air was instantly sucked out of the room. My brain flatly refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was a sensory overload that caused a physical ache in the center of my chest. There, on the bed we had picked out together at an IKEA 3 years ago, under the heavy linen duvet that my mother had bought us for Christmas, were Sarah and Mark. They weren't asleep. They weren't just talking. The betrayal was absolute, raw, and entirely undeniable. The sound of the door clicking against the wall made them both freeze. Mark's head snapped toward me first, his face instantly draining of all color, his eyes widening into pools of sheer terror. Sarah let out a sharp choke gasp, a sound that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. She frantically pulled the covers up to her chin, her body trembling violently as she looked at me standing in the doorway in my wrinkled dress shirt and slacks. Nobody spoke. The silence was deafening, amplified by the sound of the freezing rain rattling against the glass of the bedroom window. I stood there, paralyzed, watching my entire life shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces on the bedroom floor, completely incapable of moving, breathing, or understanding how the two people I loved most in the world had pulled the trigger on my existence. The silence hung over the bedroom like suffocating, toxic smoke. For a few agonizing seconds, my brain went completely numb, operating on a strange, detached delay. I remember looking at a stray coffee mug on Sarah's nightstand, focusing on the ring of dried brown liquid inside it, doing everything I could to avoid looking back at the bed. It was a coping mechanism, a desperate attempt by my psyche to reject reality. But reality was unyielding. The physical evidence of my life's destruction was less than 5 feet away from me. Mark was the first to move. He scrambled off the edge of the mattress, awkwardly fumbling with his jeans, his hands shaking so violently he could barely pull them up. The magnetic, effortless confidence that had defined him his entire life was completely gone. He looked pathetic. He looked small. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the carpet, unable to look me in the face. "Man, I am so sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whisper. "It's not what it looks like. I swear to God it's not." The absurdity of that cliché broke the spell. A sudden wave of intense heat rushed from my stomach straight to my throat, choking out any remaining shock. It's not what it looks like. The utter disrespect of that phrase, delivered by the guy who had worn my spare clothes and eaten my food for 2 months, made something snap inside me. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. The rage was too heavy, too solid for an outburst. It settled deep into my bones, turning my voice into a terrifyingly calm, dead monotone. "Get out," I said. Mark finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading.
"Bro, please let me explain. Just let us talk about this. If you say another word in this house, I will kill you," I whispered. I meant it. In that exact moment, looking at the person I had treated like a brother, I felt capable of things I didn't know a human being could feel. There was a raw, primal violence vibrating under my skin. He didn't argue. He grabbed his flannel shirt and his boots from the floor, not even bothering to put them on, and bolted past me. He brushed past my shoulder so fast I could smell his cologne, the expensive stuff I had given him for his birthday last month. I stood completely still as I listened to his frantic footsteps thudding down the stairs, followed by the heavy slam of the front door. Seconds later, the muffled roar of his Civic's engine cut through the sound of the storm, fading away as he sped down the icy street. Then there was only Sarah. She was sitting up against the headboard, the gray linen duvet clutched tightly against her collarbone. Her chest was heaving, tears silently streaming down her face, leaving dark tracks through her makeup. She looked terrified of me. That was the part that twisted the knife even deeper. The woman who used to fall asleep with her head on my chest was now looking at me like I was a dangerous stranger. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else, standing at the bottom of a deep well. She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and let out a broken, shuddering sob. "How long, Sarah?" I repeated, my voice rising just enough to make her flinch. 2 weeks, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattling window pane. "Only 2 weeks. I swear, it was an accident. It just happened, Michael." "An accident?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my throat. "You accidentally cleared off her home office? You accidentally let him into our bed? People don't accidentally ruin a 6-year relationship, Sarah. You made a choice. Every single day I was at the office trying to build a future for us, you made a choice. You weren't here, she suddenly screamed, her voice cracking with a strange mix of guilt and defensive anger. She pulled the covers tighter, her knuckles turning white. You haven't been here for months, Michael. You come home, you sit on the couch with your laptop, and you don't even look at me. I was lonely. I was so incredibly lonely, and he was actually here. He listened to me. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. For a split second, a horrific seed of self-doubt tried to take root. Was this my fault? Did I drive her to this? But as I looked around the room, at our wedding photo on the dresser, at the life we had painstakingly built together dollar by dollar, the guilt turned back into white-hot fury. I had been working 80 hours a week to pay for the roof over her head, to ensure we wouldn't have to live paycheck to paycheck like our parents did. I was sacrificing my mental and physical health for our future, and her excuse for destroying it was that she was lonely? Don't you dare put this on me, I said, my voice dropping back down to that terrifying whisper. Do not sit in the bed we bought together after what you just did and try to make me the bad guy. She collapsed inward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept. The anger in her seemed to drain away instantly, leaving behind nothing but raw shame. I'm sorry, she sobbed repeatedly, the words muffled by her palms. I'm so sorry. Please, Michael, don't leave. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, please. I couldn't look at her anymore. The sight of her tears, which used to make me drop everything just to comfort her, now made me feel physically sick. The love wasn't gone, not completely, not yet. And that was the most agonizing part. It was still there, mutated and bleeding, trapped under a mountain of disgust. I turned around without saying another word, walked down the dark hallway to the spare room that served as Sarah's office, and shut the door behind me. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat down on the small futon in the corner, pulled my knees to my chest, and stared into the darkness. The house was completely still now, save for the rhythmic, agonizing sound of Sarah sobbing in the next room. Downstairs, Max let out a low, confused whine from his crate, sensing the thick vibration of misery radiating through the drywall. I didn't sleep, not for a single second. I sat on that futon for hours, watching the gray winter light slowly creep through the blinds, illuminating the room. I watched the dust motes float in the air, thinking about how 12 hours ago, I was a happy man. I was a stressed man, sure, but I was secure. I had an anchor. Now I was completely unmoored, floating in a void of total devastation. Every memory I had of the last 2 months began to recontextualize itself in my mind, shifting into something ugly and deceptive. The shared glances across the dinner table, the way Sarah would laugh at his jokes, the afternoons they spent together while I was sitting in a gray cubicle analyzing supply chain data. It had all been happening right under my nose, and I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. I felt a profound sense of humiliation that burned hotter than the anger. I had been the oblivious fool in my own life's tragedy. By 6 a.m., the crying in the master bedroom had stopped. The house was dead silent. I stood up, my joints stiff and aching from sitting in the same position all night. My suit pants were wrinkled, and my shirt was damp with cold sweat. I walked down the stairs, filled Max's food bowl without looking at him, grabbed my car keys from the counter, and walked out the front door into the freezing morning air. I needed to breathe. I needed to go somewhere where the walls didn't feel like they were closing in on me. I spent the next 3 days living out of a generic, stale-smelling room at a Holiday Inn off the interstate. I didn't go to work. I called in sick, telling my boss I had a severe case of the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie. I felt physically ill. My stomach was a tight, twisted knot that rejected anything solid, and my head throbbed with a persistent, dull ache from the lack of sleep and the endless loop of thoughts playing in my brain. I kept the curtains drawn, letting the room stay stuck in a permanent, depressing twilight. I spent hours just staring at the popcorn ceiling, listening to the muffled roar of semi-trucks passing by on the highway outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that doorway. I saw the yellow light. I saw the heavy linen duvet. I saw the look of sheer terror on Mark's face. It was an involuntary slideshow of my own execution, playing on a relentless loop. Sarah tried to contact me.
My phone buzzed almost constantly the first 48 hours. Dozens of text messages flooded in, alternating between desperate apologies, begging me to come home, and frantic voice notes where she could barely choke out the words through her tears.
Please, Michael, just tell me you're safe. We can get past this. I know we can. It was a mistake, a horrible, disgusting mistake. I didn't answer a single one. I couldn't. Looking at her name on my screen made my chest tighten so badly I could barely catch my breath. I felt this immense, terrifying void where my life used to be. The future we had planned, the summer trips, the kids we talked about starting a family for next year, the quiet retirement in a few decades, had been completely erased in a single night. Mark didn't try to call. He knew better. But on Saturday morning, I received a lengthy email from an address I didn't recognize. It was from him. He wrote that he had packed up the rest of his things from our house while I was gone, that he was leaving Illinois for good, and that he would never look at or speak to Sarah again. He wrote about how much he hated himself, how I had been the best friend he ever had, and how he would spend the rest of his life wishing he could undo what he'd done. I deleted the email halfway through reading it. The words felt incredibly hollow. Apologies don't fix a shattered soul. They don't put the glass back together after you've smashed it against the wall. He had destroyed my life out of pure, selfish impulse, and no amount of long-distance guilt was going to change that. By Sunday evening, the paralysis started to lift, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I couldn't stay in this motel room forever, hiding from the wreckage.
I needed to face it. I needed to go back to the house, look at Sarah when I was calm, and figure out how to untangle our lives. I didn't want to fix it. Deep down, in a quiet, dark corner of my mind, I knew the marriage was dead. The moment she let him into our bed, the foundation had crumbled into dust. You can't rebuild a home on dust. I checked out of the hotel on Monday morning. The winter sky was a flat, lifeless gray as I drove back into our suburb. Turning onto our street felt surreal. The houses looked exactly the same, the neighbors were shoving snow off their driveways, and the world was moving forward as if nothing had happened. It felt deeply unfair that the universe didn't halt for my tragedy. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Sarah's car was there. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I sat there for a full 5 minutes, forcing myself to take deep, steady breaths before I opened the car door and walked up the steps. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like stale coffee and old wood. Max immediately came running from the kitchen, his tail wagging hesitantly, sensing the heavy, broken energy in the air. I knelt down and buried my face in his thick fur for a moment, letting out a shaky breath. He was the only pure thing left in this place. Michael? I looked up. Sarah was standing at the top of the stairs. She looked like she hadn't slept or showered since I left. Her hair was tied back in a messy, greasy bun. Her skin was ghostly pale, and her eyes were severely swollen and red. She was wearing the same oversized gray sweatpants she had been wearing on Thursday night. She walked down the stairs slowly, her hand gripping the banister, as if she were afraid she might fall. She stopped a few feet away from me in the living room, hovering near the edge of the rug, looking at me with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. "You're home," she whispered, her voice incredibly raw. "I'm here to pack some clothes, Sarah," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or warmth. It was the voice of a businessman delivering a termination notice. The hope instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a look of profound, crushing defeat. She covered her mouth with her hand, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her lower eyelids. "Please, Michael, don't do this. Don't just walk away from 6 years. We built this together. We loved each other." "We did," I said, looking around the living room, past her, at the gray sectional sofa where Mark used to sit. "But you chose to destroy it. You didn't think about the 6 years when you were with him. You didn't think about me." "I wasn't thinking," she sobbed, stepping closer to me, reaching out a trembling hand as if to touch my arm. I instinctively stepped back, avoiding her contact. Her hand dropped to her side, looking heavy and useless. "I was in a dark place, Michael. I felt so disconnected from you, and he was there, and he made me feel alive for a second. It didn't mean anything. It was just physical. It was a mistake. I love you. If you loved me, Sarah, the thought of losing me would have been enough to make you stop, I said, the words cutting through the air with a sharp, undeniable clarity. But it wasn't. You valued a few weeks of excitement with my best friend over our entire life together. That's the truth. You can dress it up in loneliness all you want, but that's what it comes down to. She collapsed onto the edge of the couch, burying her face in her lap, her whole body shaking as she wept uncontrollably. It was the same spot where the three of us had watched football just 3 weeks ago, laughing and drinking beer. The memory made a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. I walked past her, heading up the stairs to the master bedroom. I grabbed a large duffel bag from the closet and began throwing clothes into it blindly. Shirts, jeans, underwear, socks. I didn't care what I was grabbing. I just needed enough to last me until I could find an apartment. As I pulled open my dresser drawer, my hand hit a small velvet box hidden beneath my sweaters. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a delicate diamond necklace I had bought her 3 months ago. I had been saving it for our upcoming wedding anniversary in January. I had spent weeks picking it out, working those extra hours at the office, partly to afford something beautiful that would make her eyes light up. I stared at the sparkling stone, a sudden, sharp pain piercing through the armor of my numbness. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and dropped onto the velvet lining. The sheer weight of the betrayal hit me all over again, fresh and devastating. I had loved her with everything I had. I had given her my trust, my hard work, my entire heart, and she had traded it for a cheap thrill with the man I called my brother. I snapped the box shut, tossed it carelessly into the duffel bag, and zipped it closed. I walked out of the bedroom without looking back, carrying the heavy bag down the stairs. Sarah was still on the couch, her crying reduced to a quiet, pathetic whimper. I walked toward the front door, my hand reaching for the brass knob. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. I opened the door, stepping out into the freezing afternoon, ready to walk away from my marriage, my home, and the life I thought I knew, completely unaware that the real fallout of this betrayal hadn't even begun yet. The next few months were a masterclass in survival. I rented a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a nameless brick building closer to the city, a place that smelled permanently of pine cleaner and old radiator steam. It was a far cry from the suburban house with the backyard, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was empty. There were no ghosts of shared dinners, no lingering echoes of laughter that had secretly been mocking me. I threw myself entirely into my work. The logistics project I had been killing myself over was finally implemented, and it was a massive success. The company noticed. Within 6 weeks of moving into that apartment, I was promoted to regional director. My salary nearly doubled, and for the first time in my life, money wasn't something I had to calculate down to the penny before opening my wallet. I never saw this success coming. It was the cruelest irony of the entire situation. Now that my life was completely changed, now that I finally had the financial freedom and the professional status I had spent my 20s chasing, I had absolutely nobody to share it with. I would come home to my quiet apartment, drop my keys on the counter, and sit on my new leather chair in total silence. I had the means to buy whatever I wanted, to travel wherever I chose, but the foundation of my emotional world was still a smoking crater. The legal process of dissolving the marriage was surprisingly swift. Sarah didn't fight me on anything. When my lawyer sent over the divorce paperwork, she signed them within days, giving up her claim to the house and refusing any alimony. I think it was her final, desperate attempt to hold on to some shred of dignity, a way of saying she knew she had forfeited the right to my life. We communicated only through our legal representation, except for one final meeting at a local coffee shop in April to hand over Max's paperwork, as we had agreed I would take full custody of him. Seeing her that afternoon was like looking at a stranger who happened to occupy the body of the woman I used to love. The raw, hysterical brief from December had hardened into a quiet, permanent sadness. She looked thin, her face drawn, her eyes completely vacant. She didn't beg this time. She didn't offer any excuses about her loneliness. We sat at a small corner table, the steam from our untouched coffees rising between us like a physical wall. She pushed the folder across the table, her hand trembling slightly. "He's in Ohio, with his sister," she said softly, referring to Mark. "In case you were wondering. I haven't spoken to him since that night." "I wasn't wondering," I replied. My voice wasn't angry anymore. It was just cold, level, and entirely detached. The anger had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a vast, frozen expanse of indifference. That was the moment I knew I was truly done. When you hate someone, you still care enough to feel something. When you feel nothing, they are completely gone. She looked away, swallowing hard, her lower lip quivering just for a second before she nodded. I want you to know that I am glad you got the promotion. I always knew you would do big things, Michael. I'm sorry I couldn't be the person who got to see it happen." I didn't answer. There was no point in validating her regret. I took the folder, stood up, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting alone by the window. That was the last time I ever saw my wife. The hardest part wasn't the loss of Sarah, though that ache took a long time to dull. The hardest part was the total destruction of my ability to trust another human being. Mark's betrayal had fundamentally rewritten the rules of the world in my mind. He was the guy who knew everything about me, the guy who had stood by me through every major milestone of my adult life. If a person like that could look me in the eye, eat my food, and then systematically destroy my world without a second thought, then nobody was safe. Every new person I met, every coworker who offered a compliment, every woman who tried to start a conversation at a lounge looked like a potential threat. My brain instantly searched for the hidden angle, the lie, the inevitable knife waiting for my back. But time, as it always does, forced a slow kind of scab over the wound. I started taking Max to a massive lakeside park on the weekends, letting him run along the shoreline while I watched the waves hit the rocks. The rhythmic, steady sound of the water became a form of therapy. I started to understand that what happened wasn't a reflection of my worth or my failure as a husband. It was a reflection of two deeply flawed, weak people who made a catastrophic choice when they thought nobody was looking. Their actions belonged to them, not to me. One evening in late June, I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset bleed orange and purple across the city skyline. Max was lying at my feet, his chin resting on my shoe. My phone buzzed on the glass table. It was a notification from my banking app, showing the final direct deposit from the sale of our suburban house. The closing costs were settled, the mortgage was paid off, and a substantial lump sum of cash had just been deposited into my account. I stared at the numbers on the screen, feeling the cool evening breeze on my face. A year ago, this amount of money, combined with my new salary, would have been the ultimate dream. It would have meant the end of all our stress. Now, it was just a number. But as I locked the phone and looked back out at the city, I realized something else. The tightness in my chest was gone. The heavy, suffocating weight that had settled into my ribs on that freezing December night had finally lifted. My life was completely changed, yes. The future I had envisioned was entirely gone, replaced by an unwritten book. I was starting over at 29, wealthy but entirely alone, carrying scars that would dictate how I interacted with the world for the rest of my days. But as I reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, I felt a quiet, unexpected sense of peace. I had survived the worst thing someone could do to me, and I was still standing. The betrayal had broken my life, but it hadn't broken me.